Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for all of you joining us outside the US. Welcome to today's conversation on measuring stakeholder capitalism and how companies can take action on new market-led metrics. My name is Brian Stafford. I'm CEO of Diligent, your host for today. I'm delighted that you could be here for this important discussion around ESG metrics and accountability, and to hear more about the tremendous work from the World Economic Forum and its task force that includes Bank of America and EY on what they've been doing to provide a clear path for companies to operationalize environmental, social, and governance matters. 2020 has been an unprecedented year. A global pandemic, raging fires in Australia and California, and the social injustices we're seeing here in the US. I'm hard-pressed to think of another time when codifying ESG best practices matters more, not only to companies and investors, but also to each of us personally and to the communities around us. Many of you joining today are Diligent clients. We work with a network of more than 17,000 clients and nearly 700,000 board members and senior leaders. The most frequently asked question I get from our clients is, what should they be doing around ESG? Both public companies, but increasingly private companies as well. We want to make sure that Diligent supports you and the companies you serve at any point in your journey to measure, disclose, and truly operationalize ESG. Today, we'll hear more about the new metrics issued by the World Economic Forum, and I'm excited to share that these metrics are now integrated within a number of Diligent products, including Diligent Compliance, which should make it easy for all of you to take action on ESG. Again, thank you for this important discussion. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to today's moderator, Betsy Atkins. Betsy.
Well, thank you, Brian Stafford, and thank you, Diligent, for hosting us. I'm Betsy Atkins, and I'm both a private company director and a public company director. So I'll be moderating, but also sharing a little bit of my views from a director's viewpoint. So where are we today? Currently, there are $46 trillion of worldwide global assets under management, and a quarter of it, 12 trillion, is already focused on ESG, and it's expected that by 2025, 50% of the assets will be focused on ESG. Our index funds in the last few years have quadrupled their dedicated staff on ESG as part of their governance groups. And I experienced it firsthand. As a newly minted director at Wynn Resorts, we had a say on pay issue. So we set up meetings with Fidelity and Vanguard and State Street. And I expected we were going to talk about say on pay, but well over half of the discussion was on ESG 2 years ago. Directors are going to meet with index funds and investors increasingly, and we'll all need to have our ESG narrative on our companies. It's interesting also that major investors like Europe's Hermes, which is $1 trillion of assets under management, has stated that they're going to demand every public board have a one-page letter on its purpose and how the company's commercial mission relates to society's goals. So we're going to need to have a response on ESG. And today there are historically many different frameworks, and it's noisy. But here's the good news. The World Economic Forum, the International Business Council of the 130 largest global companies, and the big four accounting firms have spent the last few years reaching a consensus and a recommendation on 21 metrics. And I believe that if companies will embed this in their purpose and their vision and their mission, they will get a great response from their constituencies, from their stakeholders, including their investors, their employees, and their community and their customers. And I think it's critical that you control the narrative yourself as a director and as a company on what you're doing on ESG. Because if you don't publicly state what you're doing, your story will be told by a web crawling algorithm, and you'll be stuck with that as your ESG positioning. So with that as a little bit of background, I'm very, very happy to introduce our incredible panelists today. We're joined by the founder and chairman of the World Economic Forum, Professor Klaus Schwab, by the chairman and CEO of Bank of America, Brian Moynihan, and by the CEO of Ernst & Young, Carmine DeCibio. I'd like to start out, Professor Schwab, by asking you, could you share with us about the recent Impact Summit and the launch of these sustainable capitalism metrics and how that was received.
Thank you very much, Betsy. It's a great pleasure to be here. And of course, I feel very enthusiastic to talk about the metrics. And we discussed the metrics at the Sustainable Development Impact Summit, which we just conducted. And I'm grateful to be again with Brian and with Carmine, because they really have been the drivers of this project, together with the other big four companies. Now, the Sustainable Development Summit, which is closely intertwined, of course, with how to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and how companies can contribute them. And of course, that's exactly what we are talking also about when we address the issue of ESGs. The launch which we had made one thing very clear. If I look at the reactions which we got, ESGs and stakeholder capitalism is not a fad or a manifestation of business leaders to showcase their corporate social responsibility. The ESGs are an integral part of business management. It also became very clear in the discussions that the metrics are not just an additional time-consuming or accounting and reporting process. Embracing stakeholder capitalism metrics is essential to be on the right side of history and creating a long-term sustainable business model, which everybody expects to be from a responsible CEO.
That's really helpful. Thank you. Brian, can you share with us what you think is influencing the momentum? What are stakeholders demanding, and how does this support the Sustainable Development Goals?
I think what's influencing the momentum is the need to solve the problems and deal with the issues. And so that momentum has been building for many years. The concept of stakeholder capitalism, which Klaus 50 years ago put his manifesto on the table, is not something entirely new. What's happened is over that time period, and including the SDG development for the UN, there has been an agreement that these are the things we need to do. So there's an agreement we need to do something. There's agreement about the areas we need to affect. And then the question is, the other major thing that's driving this is, what's the role of capitalism? In the end of the day, we had a papal encyclical issued this past weekend. We've had various people say capitalism needs to be tamed, that capitalism needs change, that capitalism can't solve these problems. And the question is, you have the needs of the world and you have to align capitalism against them. And so to do that, you have to have a way to make sure it's aligned. And that's where a set of metrics that can give rise to stakeholder capitalism and show capitalism can make progress on these things is really required. And so what's driving is investors, management, boards of directors, governments, and various other people are interested in a particular issue are all saying, I want companies, I want capitalism to change and make it work and tame it, and whatever words people want to use, or I want you to deal with the fallout of capitalism. The question is, we need a set of metrics to measure it. So all that's come together with a 50-year trend that Klaus started, and with the near-term trend that businesses have been driving on in terms of BRT and the IBC and others making these positions. It's coalesced into it's time. And right now that Carmine and his colleagues did a great job, along with Klaus's staff and my team, to develop a set of metrics that now say, here is the capitalism defined from a stakeholder point of view.
It's really what everybody wants to learn about. So thank you for sharing that. Carmine, can you tell us about the consultation process and a little bit more about the specific metrics and the pillars, and tell us what you think, and will this be difficult for companies to adopt?
Yeah, thanks, Betsy. And just to take everyone back a little bit, there are a lot of frameworks out there in terms of metrics. And what got me excited, and the other Big Four excited, was that this was a conversation where really the power of the IBC and WEF and convening all companies together to come around to a set of metrics that we could all agree to would make sense. And so that's what got us started here. And it really got started a year in 2019, in August of 2019, where this was first discussed. And then I was at the IBC meeting in Davos in January with Klaus and Brian. And this was the discussion among CEOs in terms of, are we going to do this? Are we going to adopt this? Are we going to really push us forward? And at the beginning, we all took an electronic poll, and I'd say, 70, 75% of the people in the room at the time said, yep, we're all for this. From there, though, it was a lot of work, and a lot of work in terms of all our teams, the Big Four teams, Brian and Klaus's team, to make sure that we were talking to companies, the IBC members. There were many surveys sent out, and there was a real consultation process. We ended up with the 21 metrics and 34 supplemental metrics that people felt comfortable. And they're really divided into 4 categories: governance, planet, people, and prosperity. Each one of the Big Four took one of those categories and really developed those metrics, socialized those metrics. We did have a few sector meetings because by sector, these metrics get a little bit more tricky. So we had oil and gas, mining and metals, and electricity as a separate sector conversation to make sure that we were really taking into account what everyone had to say, what all the members of the IBC had to say. We came up with the 21 core metrics. The idea, Betsy, is that the idea behind the 21 metrics is we want to all convene around them. It's the first time the Big Four really worked on something like this together. And it's also a way, in terms of, to Brian's point and Klaus's point, to really show how your organization is all about stakeholders, and it is all about long-term value. These are the metrics that are going to show that. So where we are now, we've done a lot of socializing, and we're really, in January, we'll all come together as part of the IBC to really finalize the adoption of these metrics, and each individual company will sign up to them. What we're hoping is that it won't just be the IBC members out there, but it'll be a lot of other companies, smaller, mid-sized companies, private companies that will go from these metrics and disclose them. The idea here, Betsy, is that we're saying disclose or explain. Some people know the term comply or explain. We're using the words disclose or explain because this is not driven by the regulators. This is really driven by all of us and the private sector. So, if I give you an example, at EY, we're going to try, we've already disclosed 17 of the 21 metrics, but they're not disclosed coherently. So going forward in our fiscal year 21, we're going to really make an effort to disclose all 21. And if we can't disclose it, we'll explain why we can't disclose a certain metric. But to the points that were made before, I think the number one metric that's in the governance section is around having a purpose. And today, companies have to have a purpose. So at EY, it's building a better working world, but it really makes everything go well in terms of looking at things for the long term and long-term value. Why don't I stop, Betsy? I've talked a long time.
Well, it's
just to follow up on that quickly. Think about all the different thought process trends with stakeholder capitalism, balanced scorecards, but also think about just in the last 3 or 4 years, you've had, if we think back and, Klaus and Carmine and I, sort of thinking about the Davos UN cycle, right? They're sort of half year away from each other. It was all about the SDGs, and it was all about the environment for a while, then about women in position, board representation and women representation. And then lo and behold, as Brian mentioned earlier, had the changes in the U.S. After the George Floyd killing, and obviously the human capital becomes the next biggest focus. So the idea of having a balanced set of metrics is you're disclosing across all those dimensions at all times. And the world may shift its interest on a given day to one or the other, but the true balance is to have them all out there. And so if you just sort of trace back the last few years, you could actually see where different parts of this would be emphasized. But wouldn't it have been nice to have a comprehensive scorecard that would have talked about diversity when the issues of diversity and inclusion in companies came up, or would have talked about what you do in scope 1 and 2 if the world environment comes up, or broadly the SDGs, what are you doing to make them happen? A lot of us signed a letter in 2017, we make them happen. Or when the BRT announced that they're going to go for stakeholder capitalism, right behind it, you had here's a set of metrics that show that we're doing it. And then you had the big ESG investment trend that you laid out earlier, impact investing trends. These all would have been easier if we'd have had a set of metrics to say company A, company B, company C is doing this comprehensively across all the things that are important.
To Brian's point, I just want to make sure this is clear because we get this question all the time. We did start, and the other big four started with a lot of the different frameworks that are out there. And we really took that into account when we developed these metrics. So it's not like we created new ones or tried to create something different. We really wanted to take everything into account from the beginning.
So you didn't lose the work that you did as a company. If you've already been using a framework or a few different frameworks, this builds on that, correct?
Correct.
And if I may just add, I think it's very important when we look at the IBC with its international composition. This is not a Anglo-Saxon or a European, let's say, movement. It has to become a global movement. And in the meantime, of course, we at the World Economic Forum, we have reached out to quite a number of our other partners and members. And we have seen, even beyond the IBC members, a great interest, particularly in countries also like Japan and so on. What is important and what Carmen and Brian already emphasized is that we have a global, a common, and a comprehensive approach.
It's really good to know that the other major economies, India, China, Japan, are interested as well. That's helpful for us to think about because corporations that are multinational that want to sell in these jurisdictions and want to have investors from these jurisdictions, will respond to that. Brian, you said something earlier which triggered a thought that, if you had a comprehensive set of ESG metrics as a company 3 or 5 years ago, it would help you address many of the issues that come up. Do you think it's also so that if you have a good ESG framework, even if you are in the process of implementing all the metrics, that this would help immunize a board maybe from proxy proposals, asking specific pointed questions? What do you think?
Well, I don't know if you can ever immunize yourself fully against somebody's point of view about what the most important element is or the exact way to measure. But if you get all the types of people we're talking to agree to this, if you have, the shareholders agree to it, and we have a human capital report. We put that out, and it has a lot of the metrics that would go into the people side of this program, and we'll be disclosing those as part of it. We developed that really to sort of take on the issue of diversity in the company and take on the issue of gender pay equity and pay equity in all its forms, and how we went about it and how we disclose it, based on the points of view that the only two ways to judge that were the median male, female, et cetera, or the difference between the CEO pay and the other people's pay. So we took it on and said, here it is, but here's how you actually measure this. And so that these metrics would have been helpful if they had been both out there and agreed to, that then you could have channeled the shareholders. We talked about 40% of all the outstanding shares in individual meetings where we go through everything we do every year. Like you talked about your dialogue with Wynn, our lead independent director, Jack Bover, that does that. What this framework could give is a way for those investors and for our lead independent director, Jack Bovender, or Lionel Knowles, been elected to succeed him, could sit with those people and say, here's the scorecard, and here's the progress you made last year, and here's where we're trying to go next year. It would make it a much more organized thought than a little bit of an alphabet soup of people's judgment, measuring you in a popcorn popper what the issue of the moment is, as we call it, that would just keep coming up with a new issue. And say, look, this is our long-term view of how we have worked across the metrics relating to the planet, and what we've done, that people could see time series data. So I think there's a value to this to really, simplify that dialogue. Maybe, and I think boards should really think about that. The better you disclose, the more you're going to be able to articulate to the shareholders who count and vote on these things exactly what you've done, that you've held yourself accountable, that you've made progress, that you have a goal. Those are major things that when you get into these debates about a particular issue, that are helpful to have on the table.
Will you share a little more about how you're embedding ESG throughout your organization, Ryan? It'd be interesting to know, for example, is there a board committee that you have doing oversight of ESG? How do you think about it? Will you do, as Carmine said at EY, they're on the journey from 17 to 21. how are you going about it, and how far along are you?
Well, so think about a couple things. Yes, there's a board committee that is a ESG committee. So our governance and ESG committee handles this on board level. It's half the board. We go to the board in full continuously on these issues, whether it's in the diversity metrics through our talent planning discussions, whether it's the environmental metrics through our environmental program, and all the different things. So one is there's a board committee that governs it. There's a committee in the company led by Ann Finucane, our vice chair, that basically sets our goals and handles the issue, these issues, and makes sure that we have a trackable goal set and an understanding how we measure it. So when we went to carbon neutrality, it wasn't just the CEO saying let's get to carbon neutral. It was a long process to understand exactly how you could get to carbon neutrality as a bank, and what we had to do for scope 1 and 2, and how we could do it, and what the proper offsets were, and how do you engage with those offsets, who they are, and are they legitimate, and do they supply what we want. So the ESG committee sits on top of that. And then if you go to the question of, so the board committee, the ESG company committee, which is the senior most line of business management in the company, led by Ann, who's the vice chair, that this is part of her portfolio of work for us. But then you go to the disclosure side, and whether it's the GRI report, the SASB report, the TCFD report, the United Nations report, we report all these metrics, but that goes back a little bit to Carmine's point, is we're reporting all these metrics to a whole bunch of different people, which are slightly different calculations. And so what we're trying to do is push all that in a pile, make it one set. And then if you open our annual report and proxy statement, you'll see our human capital report referenced and included and linked into there. So we go about it not only formally by committees, board management, but also by disclosure, and then putting it in the real reports. And when this gets done, this is done now. When we adopt it, like we're asking our colleagues to do for 21, you'll see us lay this out as a report, a comprehensive report on stakeholder capitalism.
Betsy, I was just going to chime in on what Brian's doing. When we're advising clients, we're advising them exactly on what Brian's doing, and that is to really the metrics are just outcomes in terms of what you're doing. But you really have to think about, first of all, what's your strategy as an organization? And today, your strategy has to be around stakeholders, not just shareholders. And therefore, you have to take into account people, clients, society, all together. And that's what I like about these metrics and the way we've kind of come together on this is they're really the outcome of your overall strategy, starting with a purpose and then looking at your different stakeholders, including your clients, people, and society, and part of society is obviously the planet. So to me, these are really outcomes of a company's overall strategy and overall long-term strategy, to Klaus and Brian's point before, in terms of what companies should be thinking about today versus 10 years ago, 20 years ago. The times have changed, and as board members, I think that's important that you all understand the company's strategy and how that fits into not only the metrics but the long-term value framework.
May I ask you another question on that, Carmine? Not everybody on the call will be totally familiar with Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and how you actually, because those tend to be, when people hear them, qualitative attributes. And to have a good program of ESG, you need to be able to measure things quantitatively. Could you tell us a little bit about the Sustainable Development Goals and how to think about qualitative versus quantitative reporting?
Well, I think, look, when you talk to, and Brian would know more about this than me, when you talk to analysts and so forth, and when we talk to the investing community, they very much come up with quantitative. They want numbers. They want to be able to compare numbers to last year's numbers and so forth. So there is a sense of, trying to be as quantitative as possible. And that takes time, and that takes processes and so forth. But I do think the more you can get some of these goals to a quantitative nature, the better. And you might not start there, but it's a place to be.
It's interesting when you think of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are people, planet, prosperity, as you articulated, those being the 4 pillar groups. You can look at an example I thought that MasterCard had in their ESG report, where they said they took 500,000 people who were unbanked and not in the financial services system. And by bringing them into the system, you were helping prosperity on the planet, which was part of the big UN goals, the qualitative things, but they correlated to a business outcome that could be measured. So I think companies can thread that needle. Brian, can you chat just a little bit? Some of these things are hard for different sectors. And, talk to us a little bit about the oil and gas sector, where it's really perhaps more difficult. And, why would, there's a difference of some oil and gas companies being more progressive than others, and why it's important to go forward and disclose or explain for some of these real economy companies that are more challenged. Please share your thoughts here.
Well, I think a couple things. One, and Klaus can talk also about the West organizational structure, for lack of a better term, of methodology, how we have industry verticals, and the IBC is across all of them. And you mentioned Ajay and MasterCard; they're one of the members of the IBC and fully supportive with us. So but if you think about it, these metrics they apply to different industries specifically, the financial services industry, oil and gas, the mining. What Carmine talked about was what we did in the work. Let's just focus there. We went and said, let's get these aggregate metrics. Let's look across this broad set of 21 to 24. We dropped ones that people couldn't quite do or we couldn't figure out how to do. But we went through each individual sector and thought about it from a sector specific, because ultimately it comes down to the idea is if you have them in the sector and you can look at these metrics and look at 10 companies in the sector and see which companies are doing enough. They don't have to be the number one company, because then you only have one of the 10 you'd ever invest in or lend to. What we ought to be able to do as a bank is look at those sector specific outcomes and say, look, if the person's above the bar, i.e. they're doing what they should do and making progress, we should stay with them and lend to them. And our Merrill Lynch colleagues should not shy away from investing in them in things like that. There's no more sort of starker question on this right now than the oil and gas industry, because there's a lot of people say divest is the only way to solve the problem. We believe the right answer is to get the industry to make the transition, and these metrics will help the outside world judge their transition. And if we don't make the transition, we're going to have a problem. And if we don't have these companies participate and help drive the transmission, we're fooling ourselves, because we need the energy for the world to be able to make progress and prosper right now. So you can't have Ajay's unbanked people without power to run the machine that takes that card that goes to the unbanked. You can't have everything. So I think the way to do it is to get these adopted industry specific. It is harder for an oil and gas company to say, I'm going to be carbon neutral, which is another part of what Klaus and a group of us asked them to do, because it's their very business model. But if they're on a transition path, and you've seen announcements by companies along this dimension, and we as consumers of electricity or other energy sources demand that we want cleaner sources, you then have the natural business synergy where we need more clean power. We just did a deal with Duke Power for a major installation in North Carolina to meet our environmental commitments, and then help them build a plant, which can then help them meet other people's environmental commitments. It's that demand side along with their commitment to make the change that Lynn Good and the colleagues are making there. So think about that. Yes, it's hard. Yes, they're sector specific. Yes, it's difficult. But if they're willing to make the change, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to help us create demand to help make that change. And then secondly, help them financially make the change, invest in and make the change, but make sure they're on the path. That's making the transition happen. And that's what I think is critical about metrics by the industry. Klaus, you might want to talk about some of the industry specific.
No. Betsy, let me just follow up. The World Economic Forum, in addition to the IBC, we have industry-specific groups, and the work of the IBC, of course, is taken up in each of those groups, and to add the group-specific characteristics to the metrics. I would like to come back also to what Brian has said, how much the ESGs today are interwoven with strategy. But let's not forget, ESGs are not just a burden. They are fantastic means to strengthen the competitiveness of a company. Because at the end, a company which can rely on better and more committed employees, a company which can rely on loyal customers, which can rely on access probably at more preferential conditions to financial means, I think has a competitive advantage. So we should see the whole ESG metrics as a means to gain also competitive advantage for the company. One other point I would like to come back is the SDGs. We, in our experience at the World Economic Forum, we run at the moment about 100 different initiatives where we engage companies into specific actions or initiatives, projects to improve specific parts or to contribute to the SDGs. And we have seen that companies have their pet, which is very laudable, so pet projects, and engage very much maybe in one thing. But what we create with those metrics is the awareness that actually it's not enough to be good in one aspect and to neglect the other aspects. I think here you have really a comprehensive approach to what I would call stakeholder responsibility. And maybe just one last comment related to something Carmine said. When I talk to companies to adapt or to how they react, you find sometimes a negative reaction because companies feel it's like a beauty show. You have to get naked and people will criticize you. My reaction, it's not a beauty show. It's a process. Of course, you have to report about the outcomes, but what is even more important behind the outcomes is the process through which you, over time, improve the outcomes. So it's this comprehensive approach and long-term approach which is required of companies adopting ESG metrics.
It's very helpful that you say that, because I think our audience hears ESG as something they have to do today completely. And it's a journey, and it's fine that you're doing part of the metrics and over time improving and looking comprehensively at a set of values for your company that you can then operationalize to all your stakeholders. Can you tell us, what do you think long-term, Professor, what will be next? Will there be a global standard, do you think? What role will the IBC and the World Economic Forum play going forward in this process?
When we look back at and Carmine has much more experience and knowledge, but when we look at the history of financial metrics, it took a long time until you had globally accepted rules for doing so. We certainly should aim at creating a globally accepted system. And the fact that the 4 audit companies support it, I think, is a very good, because they are all internationally active, is a very good step in the right direction. What we want to do is to make the IBC companies role models to achieve a high degree of adaptation in the coming months. And then to move out at least to the other partner and member companies of the World Economic Forum. But we have to make a true movement. We have to mobilize everybody to recognize that the context for doing business has changed. We are not living anymore in the age of shareholder capitalism. We are living in the age of stakeholder capitalism. And this requires new approaches, and it requires particularly new measurement systems. I think there will be such a pressure from investors, the young people who look for employment, the customers and so on. No company will escape. And the problem for a company will not be, do I adapt it or not? The problem will be, will I be too late and lose in competitive advantage compared to the rest of, let's say, of my competitors?
Just to follow up, because you think about large companies and everything. So, well, large companies, we have staff, we have capabilities, and et cetera. But we built these metrics so they could go down through all size companies. And and for private companies, some of them may not be quite. You might want to do it a little bit differently. Like board governance for a privately owned company, the owner, can pick the board of directors because they are the shareholder, right? And so, there's some elements that may change, but the reality is, the diversity of employment in the company, that has nothing to do with whether we have 200,000 employees or somebody has 20 employees. You need to have diversity to go to Klaus's point. If you're going to attract the best talent, you're going to attract the customers, and so and even smaller companies are going to be challenged, on these metrics over time. Nothing doesn't flow downhill in terms of size, in terms of everything that goes on at larger companies and the shareholder dialogues and stuff ultimately makes it through as just the way the natural world works. And so I think we have thousands of potential directors on your calls because of your ability to bring them together along with Brian and Diligent. So the idea is somebody say, well, that doesn't apply to me. That's just the big S&P 100 companies or whatever. It'll get there because you have shareholders, and you're going to have shareholders that make claims. You have customers, you have employees, everything Klaus said. And by the way, you ought to be aligning yourself to help drive what society needs from you, or long term your company's not going to be successful. And honestly, that's what our research team has been able to sort of prove from the research side, is that if you don't do well in ESG metrics, if you didn't invest in those companies, you could have avoided 90% of the bankruptcies of the last decade. That's different than trying to argue whether you're outperformance, and you'll get different studies and people debate. But the reality is I can avoid the companies that are problematic, whether you're a lender, looking at loan credit, or whether you're an investor looking at the equity investment. Those are important things. So I think this will flow into a broader base, and we've made them flexible enough to help us do that.
I'm glad you said about small cap and mid cap and private companies, because absolutely all of the private equity and venture capital companies that invest in private companies or privately owned, those limiteds who invest in those private equity and venture funds, they care quite a bit about ESG. So private companies are feeling the encouragement, nudge to invest in ESG. I wonder, where do you think the ESG metric should reside? Will it be a regulator, a standard setter? Could you share, and like everybody's view on where will the oversight of the metrics live?
Well, and Carmine and Klaus to share their views. At the end of the day, the role of the IBC was to develop them, get them agreed to by companies. Carmine and his colleagues, making sure these are, for lack of a better term, doable and understandable and measurable, not only for their enterprise, which Carmine already talked about, but for the companies they work with, which are all sizes of companies across the whole globe. So we believe, all of us believe, it's got to go into some place that can then carry it forward. And there's other places that already do similar things. And so one of the byproducts is convergence of the metrics and even convergence of the standard setters. But the idea of it, it's got to be in a standard setter who can keep it accurate and live and give it that credibility. And so, but we had to build it so the companies could say they agreed with it. Otherwise, you'd end up having a standard setter and the companies would have gone somewhere else. Witness why, SASB isn't fully adopted yet, or GRI. Not everybody's doing any of these things. And so that's the value. So as we talk to those standard setters, we're open-minded as to how it long-term fits in. We just had to incubate it and get it done and to get it applied. And the long-term, it needs to have an architecture around it, no different than, the FASB or IFRS and things like that have a longevity to it in a measurement system. The one thing I'd put, which is a little different point, but we shouldn't forget, is you remember that we're also trying to deliver a set of metrics that the regulatory fraternity can actually use also. So whether they make it into, because of policies and policymakers and decisions, into country A, country B, country C, or trading block A, B, or C. The reality is we built the metrics in mind that this would be a set of metrics that those governments could also think about and hold you to, which is important because when you go to the different size companies, ultimately, if these become the law or the regulation, you're going to have to follow them no matter how small or big you are. And I think governments are looking to how they regulate, really stakeholder capitalism, if you think about it. So let me ask Carmine to talk about where to house them. So the concept of we'll house them somewhere, it's got to have longevity to it. And that's part of the work process going on now. But Carmine, do you want to add your thoughts to that since you?
Yeah. So Brian, I think you said it well, actually. I mean, we don't have any ownership here in terms of having the houses in any particular place. But I do think as these develop, the standard setters and the regulators, to your point, Brian, they will start incorporating this in their discussions. We've already been having discussions with the standard setters and regulators. And so, every country is a little bit different. Some might be more advanced versus others. But over time, because of the convening of these and them all coming together, all the big four working on them together, I think it'll be easier for regulators and standard setters to really adopt these metrics as the core metrics to start and then go from there. But Brian's right. I mean, over time, they're going to have to be housed with the same way, as Klaus said, the same way the accounting standards, took time and took a long time. I'm hoping this happens faster. And they became, part of regulations. And even though we do have two, IFRS and US GAAP in the general world today, we're hoping that maybe these could only be in one place versus 2 or 3 places. But I think it'll come because, as we've said during this whole process, this is not just about disclosing metrics. It's about it's about stakeholder capitalism, and it's about where companies to go going forward, and it's about their strategy. It's about what they need to do. It's about their people. I mean, if you don't have a purpose today, at EY, for example, our average age of our employees is 27 years old. If we don't really talk about our purpose and they don't believe in our purpose of building a better working world, we won't be able to hire the best talent. And so some of this will start really taking on as we start, disclosing some of this as it becomes part of the normal processes that we go through.
I just want to add, first, we have already talked to the standard setters and actually created some kind of a more common movement. But what I'm particularly proud of is that this initiative is not imposed top-down, but it's really coming from the business itself, because the other alternative would have been governments taking, let's say, action, probably different action in different countries. But here we have business who has taken the initiative. It's much more self-regulatory. Finally, coming to the issue of purpose. In preparing for this meeting, I have looked at the purpose of about 50 companies or so, mainly IBC companies and other forum members. And so it's practically not one company which doesn't include some societal objective in its purpose statement. So the question comes up, why to measure a company only in financial terms and not to keep it responsible and accountable of how it achieves really the societal purpose, which usually it has very much on the cover of many of its documents.
Professor, you're so right, and boards are going to face this. In the European asset manager Hermes that has $1 trillion under management is requiring that public company board members disclose a one-page statement of purpose. So companies are going to need to do that, and they're going to need a framework that measures their purpose. Question, Professor, what do you think boards should be asking, and where do you think the board should start?
The board, of course, has the top accountability for the ESG adherence. But I think it's the responsibility of the board also to make sure that jointly with the top management, the ESG responsibility is integrated deeply into the culture of the company. So I don't see so much here a differentiation between the board and the rest of the company. I think ESGs should be at the core of every decision made in the company, of course, together with as a twin to the economic considerations. But it cannot be separated. The economic, the strategy of a company and how to achieve the ESGs are deeply intertwined.
Do you have some thoughts on the role of the board, Carmine? What should the board be doing?
Yeah, Betsy, thanks for asking. I mean, we've held several sessions with board of directors, and this is a hot topic in every single session. And I think a lot of it, in fairness to a lot of directors that are on boards right now, when they were in management, they didn't necessarily live through this. So this isn't the same as some of the things that people live through. This is obviously something that we've all been talking about, but really is evolving as we speak. We're talking about metrics today, but the whole concept's evolving. So it is an area where the board and the directors need to understand better. And that's part of the reason why we want to do things like we're doing right now in terms of educating the boards and the directors. But I also think it's important that the boards talk to the CEOs and really understand what they're going to do about not only the metrics, but the different areas around stakeholder capitalism, and also how they're eventually going to get to the metrics. I think board members asking that question going forward will be incredibly important as we move forward. And I do think it's important to the company going forward. So the best thing board members can do right now is ask a lot of questions, ask the CEO a lot of questions around, if we're not going to use these metrics, what are you going to do? How are you going to get there? It's everything that we're hearing when we serve our clients.
And in fact, I think it's a macro trend I'm seeing that board members are speaking to big investors more frequently. And the other group to speak to would be your investors and see what they think. One quick question, Carmine. What about liability? Boards look at this and worry, are we going to be vulnerable to lawsuits? Some companies are hesitating. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is where you get into more of an issue, whether we like it or not, but more of an issue in the US versus maybe some other countries where liability is a bigger factor. And, we worked on a project before this project called EPIC, where we really focused on the people metrics. And we had a hard time towards the end of that project really getting US companies to actually sign up to those metrics, because while the CEO and even the CFO were in agreement, when it got to the lawyers, there was a lot of pushback. But we eventually got there. And I do think this is something that you're going to have to weigh the risks versus the liability. I personally don't think there's a lot of liability with this, but I am sure that you're going to have lawyers out there saying that there is. And like everything else, it's going to be a business decision versus maybe a liability decision. But I think the metrics that are being disclosed and that we've come together on are pretty simple metrics around your organization. And it's something that I think, again, if you can't disclose it, then explain why. But you have to move forward. I don't know, Brian, you're probably in a better seat to answer that than I am.
I think, Carmine, you described it, which is, you could theorize that some of these may create liability because you disclose the fact. The problem is that if you get in a lawsuit, you're going to end up putting all these facts on the table anyway. And is it better to sort of handle it? And so, I think working with your lawyers and stuff, people have to make their judgment. But I think the board should press this, saying, wait a second, if we got sued about this issue, about discrimination in hiring, or about our environmental activities, or about you pick it, wouldn't we have to disclose this all anyway? And and it looks like we're trying to hide it. So I think you might get a different sort of pragmatic thought process around it. But we thought about it. Carmine and his colleagues thought about it. They obviously had discussions, and again, I think people can take a different point of view, but I think that's a short-term view versus a long-term view, which is we have the obligation to do the right thing along these areas. If we don't, that's going to be the lawsuit, or that's going to be the shareholder disinterest in us, or that's going to be the customer disinterest, or that's going to be the employee disinterest. You talk about brand destruction across time. If you sit there and say, I don't care about what society cares about, I don't care to do anything about it, and I'm going to try to hide from it, I think you have big risk on your brand destruction, your employee favorability destruction, and ultimately your shareholder destruction. And remember, Betsy, when you talk about those shareholders, in a lot of cases, they are stewarding the assets. They aren't the owner. And what people should make sure, the board of directors, is the underlying owners of those assets are driving those asset managers that we spoke about to take in this account. So it's the people who give them money are saying, I need you to take this into account. That's what's driving the movement for the asset managers. They would do it on their own, but they're doing it faster because the people who give them money to steward and do it are saying, I want you to think about this. I want you to be long-term. I want you to think about stakeholder capitalism. I believe in this, because they represent society, which that's where the SDGs came from. So it's a circle to think about this, that you're going to be sued when you ultimately know the people you serve from every aspect want you to do this, and they've expressed it.
It's so interesting you say that, because if you go back in time a few years ago, the big push for adding gender diversity came out of the index funds. As soon as State Street Global Advisors did a withhold on 400 companies that didn't have 2 or more women directors, you saw that roll through all the other stewards, all the big index funds. And that was the big accelerant. And I think we'll see that here as well in driving adoption very quickly. I wonder, this is just a sense of what you think, all of you, how far are we on the journey? Are we 20% of the companies reporting on ESG? Are we halfway? Where do you think we are, and how long, what's your crystal ball?
I think we're in our journey for the IBC. We're probably, 30, 40% of the companies have sort of said they're going to do it. But this is the crunch time. Until we gave them the release, 2 weeks ago, it was a draft and moving through. Now that we're done with it, it says this is what we're asking to do. This is what Klaus and the IBC executive committee and myself and the left board are all asking to do. So I think that'll start to build towards the annual meeting in January, and then it'll cascade beyond that. And so, that's sort of practical limited by the IBC, the stakeholder metrics that we're talking about. If you think about it more broadly, Carmine and Klaus, these are not new concepts. Everybody does it somehow.
Yes.
And I do multiple somehows. I can just rattle off 5 somehows that are at the top of the house for us: GRI, SASB, UN, TCFD, our own human capital report, which is proprietary. So if you think about it, we have an ESG performance summary. So everybody's doing it somehow, especially larger companies, because they, like you said, the shareholders or their customers or employees have pushed them to do something and be more disclosing in this, or the shareholder proposals and advocacy over the years. So I think it's, my note to the directors would be, you're doing this already. If you do it in an organized fashion, and we can all work it, we can actually get it to be much more simple, much more direct. And frankly, you spend more time on concentrating actually making the things happen and less time on trying to fulfill metrics and reports for a bunch of different people who ask you kind of the same thing, but different. And the energy ought to go into fixing the things or doing the things or whatever it is to making the SDGs happen, not into let me fill out 15 different ways people want to be looking at the environmental metrics. That is wasted energy. And, there's 600 seminars in the year 2019, I think, or something in North America alone about ESG metrics and investing.
Betsy, if I may just ask, what is essential today for a company is not so much the capital, it's the trust capital which a company has. And ESGs are in some way the measurement for the trust the society, the company enjoys inside the society. And I always have to say, we should have a very good conscience. We should have a positive attitude. We should have an aggressive attitude. ESG should not be argued about out of a defensive way. No, it's a great thing, and it's a great contribution to social progress, but also to economic development in the world.
But to Klaus's point, this is what we refer to as the genius of the and. You have to produce your shareholder returns and produce for society. It's not an or, because if we don't do both, we won't have the sustainability of the effort. That's what private industry really brings us different, which is we can sustain the effort if we can produce the returns and we can make progress on SDGs and we can deliver shareholder returns. That means we can invest more and more to make it happen because it's providing returns. If we went to or, then somebody say, well, I'm not getting my shareholder returns. Let's get rid of Moynihan and let's start with somebody else. The reality is the obligation of the board and management is to make sure you're doing and if you're doing and, then you're going to be all the trust capital, the customer capital, the employee capital, et cetera, will be coupled with the shareholder capital returns. And so that genius of the end is critical for people to understand. This is not an or, it's an and.
And Betsy, to that point, even from a board perspective, if you take and you disclose the 21 metrics, and then you're going to be able to see progress versus those 21 metrics, that will very much tell the board and all the directors in terms of how well you are doing. I think Klaus said it earlier, this is not about just putting up one number at one point in time. It's how are you going to progress and how are you going to improve on those numbers. I think it's a great way for actually a board to take a look at the company itself to see how you're doing from a stakeholder perspective.
Well, thank you. And what a great set of discussions. I've learned so much from you, and I know the audience has. I can't believe the time has flown by. So I want to thank all of you. And I want to leave you with a call to action in the audience. Go to your management, go to your board, and ask what your company's ESG profile is, and see what your peer and competitors' ESG profile is. And start by getting credit for the good things you're already doing. Almost every company has great HR policies of diversity, inclusion, equal pay, safety, data security, environmental. Capture that and communicate it and put it in a framework. The IBC 21 seems like the one that will end up being universally adopted, or some other framework, but start the process and figure out, where should ESG live in your board? Should it be on your audit committee that does enterprise risk management? Should it be on your compensation committee because you might tie the CEO or management's pay to achieving ESG goals? Or maybe your governance committee that does your culture and your purpose. But if you give it a home, it'll make it real. And the same thing functionally. Should it be in your finance organization, HR, operations, GC? But start the process and make it real. And make sure you're measuring something material to your industry. You don't want to be accused of greenwashing. So for example, at Volvo, we measure our CO2 because we've said half of our fleet by 2025 will be electric. And we measure that we have an ethical supply chain because electric car batteries come from cadmium, which is mined in the Congo, and we don't want any child labor. So for Volvo to report on water usage, that would be greenwashing. But if you're an oil and gas company that fracks, you better report on your water usage. So pick something that you can measure quantitatively, show progress year on year. And then tell the good news to all your stakeholders. Be sure that you publish it on your website, that you put it in an ESG report, in the CEO's annual letter, in the proxy. Get the credit, because you're going to go there. You might as well do it right and get out in front of it. So thank you for your time today. It's been really great to be with you all. And have a great rest of your day. Bye.